Motherfuckers! Let's talk about the throat and its ability to respond to childhood trauma many years later. This is the extra long form version of the episode. Surprise! It's a brand new thing that I'm doing, and it includes results and study limitations with extended commentary on both. It's for the real thinkers out there. Maybe we do this forever, maybe not. But the results of this paper were incredible. And if you want to talk research, yeah, we'll fucking talk research. And we'll do so today as we explore the paper that I told you to hold out for. Investigating past trauma in laryngo-responders versus non-laryngo-responders, piloting new methods in an exploratory study. It's by Becker et al. From the Journal of Voice, 2022. Let's begin, as usual, with the introduction. We know by now, hopefully, if you've been here for more than a few minutes, that the body responds to stress in undiagnosable and debilitating ways. What we might not know is stress counts as anything that offsets balance mentally, physically, and or emotionally, and the three are related. A single dose of stress can be significant, but regularly or chronically repeated stress responses establish a basis for lasting diseases, dysfunctions, and pathologies. We make a point to say stress responses because the original stress event doesn't have to continue to be present. The brain or body may continue to react as though it is. Common provokers are early childhood traumas, depression, and anxiety. Common outcomes include digestive disorders like IBS. They say numerous bodily regions are affected by stress. A stressor, defined as anything that threatens homeostasis, Greek for steady state, or equilibrium, can initiate psychological, physiological, and emotional changes. This mind-body link undergirds many of the historical and current clinical and theoretical frameworks used to understand so-called functional disorders and medically unexplained symptom complexes. It is thought that when acute stress responses are repeated over time, sometimes regardless of whether the initiating stressor remains present, a stage is set for the pathogenesis and maintenance of chronic impairments. For instance, people are more susceptible to developing a functional gastrointestinal disorder such as irritable bowel syndrome if they also have experienced depression, anxiety, and early adverse life events. Overall, the link between childhood maltreatment and somatization later in life is well established. It remains unclear, though, why a functional disorder manifests in one bodily region versus another. Okay, we know that stress, trauma, abuse, and mistreatment lead to somatic impairments, potentially with significant delay. What we don't know is why some biological systems are affected instead of others, and why this is seen variably between individuals. One area of trauma-inspired dysfunction is thought to be the throat, specifically the larynx, which takes care of speaking and swallowing. Muscle tension dysphonia, as we've heard recently, is anecdotally connected to stress load and has the outcome of losing the ability to speak. It is characterized by excessive, abnormal tension in the muscles around the larynx, voice box, and it causes the vocal cords to overexert and work inefficiently, resulting in a strained, hoarse, or weak voice, vocal fatigue, and throat pain or tightness. The authors tell us a specific bodily region of interest is the larynx, and by extension, its functions such as voice and swallowing, all of which are also vulnerable to effects of acute stress. One voice disorder commonly linked to stress is that of primary muscle tension dysphonia, which comprises a substantial portion of clinical caseloads in specialty voice centers. So, although the link between imbalance and eventual voice loss, or any other functional disorder, is not currently understood, there is some common wisdom that somatic ailments are somehow symbolic, or reflective, or awfully coincidental presentations of prior life experiences. For instance, not being able to stand up for oneself could manifest in back issues, or, in this case, not being able to speak for self protection or expression during or after a stressful event could lead to later voice impairments. Psychosomatic illness, therefore, could be metaphorical or directly representative of traumatic events. They say a historical school of thought is that the functional voice disorder will manifest in a manner that has a symbolic significance or functional purpose, sometimes referred to as the conflict over speaking out. Another theory is that the most at-risk part of the body will simply accept the dysfunction caused by the stress. The imbalance will strike here. If the voice or throat is already compromised, it could acquire the burden of the trauma. They tell us an alternative theory is that of the vulnerable pathways hypothesis, where manifestation of discomfort or dysfunction occurs at a site of least resistance, i.e., a bodily region that is already weakened or vulnerable in some way. And lastly, there is the possibility that particular personality plus situational factors come together to cause some people to experience voice and throat responses, while others don't. They tell us a more well-developed theory implicating stress in the pathogenesis and maintenance of MTD, that's muscle tension dysphonia, is the trait theory of voice disorders, which holds that unique features of a person, e.g., personality traits, in combination with certain situations, in particular those that are deemed negatively stressful to that person, will trigger maladaptive laryngeal responses. In light of these unknowns and observations, researchers began referring to those affected as laryngo-responders, individuals who, for unknown reasons, experience distress alongside changes in the throat, causing voice or sensational disorders. Some folks report pain or vocal alterations during or after upset. Others do not. What is the difference between the two? Becker et al. Tell us, Aronson proposed the term laryngo-responder to refer to someone who is predisposed, whether by physical or psychological makeup, to express emotional distress through changes of the function or sensation of the larynx or voice, and eventually develop a voice disorder. For example, some individuals might report that they experience throat pain or vocal changes during periods of acute stress. By definition, these people might be considered self-reported laryngo-responders. Of course, the diverse nature of the stress experience is probably part of this discrepancy. Stress itself isn't a determinedly negative thing, though it is marked by tension and it comes with change. Some stressful events are positive, like new jobs, babies, marriage. Others are traumatic. They cause a degree of pain, suffering, and functional compromise. Major life events, social changes, disasters, and accidents are some examples of long-lasting stressors that alter thought, emotional, and living patterns long term. Even after the events conclude, the imbalance that they caused can live on in the body, like perpetual echoes. This is confusing to the individual and medical science due to the variable nature of physical disorders. In terms of laryngo-responders, the connection between past trauma and vocal defect seems clear for some, but it has not been well investigated or documented. They tell us, it is important to note that while stress is often portrayed as a negative experience, stress and stressors are not uniformly negative, harmful, or traumatic. In contrast, traumatic experiences are always stressful, involve some level of harm to the person experiencing them, and typically compromise the individual's functional capacity to some degree. Traumatic events such as family and social violence, disasters, and accidents can create a threat that may temporarily or permanently alter their capacity to cope or alter the physiological stress response of the individual. These changes often present as abnormal, patterned psychophysiological reactivity, not just in the face of trauma reminders or triggers, but even when the person is exposed to patently neutral stressors. Given this backdrop, it is feasible that the manner in which one's body responds to stress in the present day might be reflective, at least to some degree, of their past traumatic experiences. Relatively little is known about the relationship between a person's voice or vocal subsystems and their past experiences of trauma, although the situation seems indisputable for some individuals, at least. So, for these authors, the throaty response is the focus. By identifying those affected in the population, they say, somatic disorders could be more efficiently studied. Rather than sending those afflicted to voice pathologists, they might visit psychotherapists. And rather than studying myriad somatic ailments in general populations, hoping for clear connections between dissimilar biological systems, throat responders might be separated from, say, those who are gut or headache impaired by stress, the authors say. For our line of research interested in the pathogenesis and maintenance of functional voice disorders, the proactive identification of participants with elevated laryngeal and/or voice-specific symptoms are of particular interest. The ability to identify laryngo-responders would facilitate well-designed and more appropriately populated research studies, with the rationale being that it might be ineffective and inefficient to spend resources studying voice stress psychophysiology in a cohort comprised of mostly gut responders and headache responders. This framing motivates the exploratory methods in the present study, as we sought to probe linkages between self-reported childhood experiences of trauma and the nature of physical stress response patterns that rise to individuals' awareness in the present day. This exploratory study sought to 1. Pilot methods for identifying self-reported laryngo-responders. 2. Generate preliminary data regarding self-identified laryngo-responders and the extent to which they might differ from non-laryngo-responders in experiences of past trauma. And 3. Obtain information regarding the communicative context of their trauma experiences. These points are the motivations behind this study, where childhood trauma and neglect were compared against biological stress responses of the present. The purpose was to improve identification of throat responders, understand differences in the traumatic histories between laryngo responders versus non-laryngo responders, and better understand how communication of prior trauma may be implicated in vocal dysfunction. In other words, if disclosure and support weren't available, could this contribute to later vocal box impairment? And how did they begin to address these complex questions? Methods. Here's the thing. The authors did not have tools to do this investigation, so they made some. Instrument design. In the absence of any validated or standardized tools which could assist with identifying laryngo responders or providing insight into the communicative context of the participants' past trauma experiences, we developed 2 original instruments with these aims. 1. A tool used to identify laryngo responders, and 2. A set of questions that would provide insight about the communicative context in which individuals' most notable past trauma occurred. These 2 forms are described below. First, the authors created the Physical Report Form, PRF. This was a Show Me Where Trauma Has Touched You tool using a genderless mannequin split into 6 planes, where participants marked the areas most affected by dysfunction or pain. They were given paper copies of the diagram and used colored pencils for expression of these responses. They say, Physical Report Form, PRF. The PRF was designed to enable participants to identify the body systems in which they tend to have, quote, a pattern or history of vulnerability in the face of, quote, stress or other heightened emotion, and the manner in which these responses occur. The PRF is closely modeled on figurines commonly used by physicians and researchers to elicit patient report of the location and severity of bodily pain. A front and back view of a gender-neutral mannequin was visually divided into 6 horizontal planes. Simple anatomic reference words, e.g., neck, shoulders, upper back, face, head, were printed in each subdivision of the body. Although the primary area of interest was the laryngeal area and its behavioral functions, the PRF did not emphasize any bodily region over any others to avoid biasing participant responses. Participants were given a hard copy form. They completed it using colored pencils to allow for unbiased expression and possibility of user-guided differentiation of responses throughout the body. Secondly, the Ideal Internal and External Communication Questionnaire, IECQ, tool was developed to qualify the ideal communication circumstances post-trauma. In other words, did the individual receive compassion and support as they would hope? Were they able to disclose safely? Previous tools we've heard about, like the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire, for instance, do not include questions about this post-traumatic experience, which the authors note may explain differences in long-term stress responses, since they are examining the effects of trauma on the throat. Unwelcome, stressful, or punitive communication about childhood trauma is of utmost concern. Thus, they developed this unique questionnaire, the Ideal Internal and External Communication Questionnaire, to better understand how individuals spoke to themselves and others post-trauma. They say, Ideal Internal and External Communication Questions, IECQ. The IECQ was designed to operationalize and outline the qualities of an ideal, in quotes, communication scenario surrounding a traumatic experience. A notable feature of most validated and commonly used trauma questionnaires, the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire, Trauma History Questionnaire, Traumatic Life Events Questionnaire, is that they do not tend to query respondents about the communicative context in which their trauma occurred. That is, most trauma instruments do not probe whether, how, when, with whom, or to what extent the individual was able to communicate about their experience of trauma. Yet, the communicative context in which trauma occurred seems relevant to understanding trauma in general, as well as for the effect of parsing who might develop one functional disorder versus another. Perhaps the experience of a stressful and potentially traumatic event is less predictive of certain outcomes than the communicative context in which it occurred. For example, being prevented from speaking out, receiving punishment for speaking out, or being pre-verbal during the traumatic experiences may influence one's experience of trauma. Conversely, having a trusted person to confide in about the abuse could also impact one's ability to navigate the trauma. Most existing trauma scales solicit little, if any, information about the communicative milieu in which past trauma occurred. To fully understand these complex topics, we see value in collecting information about the communicative circumstances with regards to one's traumatic experiences. So, the IECQ specifically examines how individuals communicated with themselves post-trauma. For starters, if they addressed their experience compassionately and emotionally to them. And it also explores communicating outwardly about the events. How were their words received? These questions were answered via a simple scale where participants marked how ideal each experience was along a 100-millimeter line. For later data analysis, this scale was broken into categories of low, medium, and high idealness. They tell us the IECQ presented two different types of ideal communication scenarios to participants, summarized as follows. Internal communication describes communication with oneself and their own acknowledgement of their feelings or emotions, whereas external communication refers to their communication with others about their traumatic experiences. Each scenario was presented to participants with verbal explanations and confirmation of their understanding. Participants then used a 100 millimeter visual analog scale to respond to each of the two questions for each of the two types of communication. To render the ideal internal and external communication data as categorical variables, the continuous data, originally from 0 to 100 for each variable, were binned into low, medium, and high categories. Those are the tools. So who are we looking at? Participants. Participants were cisgender women from 19 to 65 years old who responded to flyers in the Pittsburgh area. This demographic reflects the population most likely to have voice disorders per vocal pathology clinics. A number of health conditions ruled out some participants for the study, such as anything easily diagnosable, like asthma, respiratory disorder, pregnancy, etc. They say recruitment was conducted via public-facing flyers posted throughout the Pittsburgh metropolitan region. Healthy, self-identified cisgender women between ages of 19 to 65 were eligible. People assigned female at birth were recruited to investigate the demographic that is reportedly most likely to comprise traditional voice-disordered caseload in voice-specialized clinics. Exclusionary criteria by self-report were as follows. Assigned male at birth. Difficulty hearing or understanding conversational speech without aids. Difficulty reading written words aloud. Difficulty using the computer sufficiently enough to complete tasks. Pregnancy. Current lower or upper respiratory illness or seasonal allergies with respiratory manifestation. Current voice handicap index 10. Score greater than 11. History of voice disorders, difficulty breathing or known respiratory disorders, autonomic dysfunction or dysautonomia, asthma. Participants received $10 per experimental hour upon completion of the study. Settings and procedure. This research was conducted in a university laboratory space where they completed questionnaires and were given the option to opt out of the study when the trauma-related probes began. In addition to the tools already discussed, they answered the childhood trauma questionnaire short form, which was further used to create a score of adverse childhood experiences. They also responded to the trauma history questionnaire and dissociative experiences scale. They say, in phase 1 of the study, all participants completed the PRF and two questionnaires not discussed here, the Multidimensional Personality Questionnaire brief form and the State and Trait Anxiety Index. Researchers designed the recruitment and initial consent process of this study to minimize self-selection bias, foregoing consent to the trauma-related portions of the study until after completing the first phase. At that point, researchers presented each participant with the option of continuing their participation by progressing to phase 2, which involved the completion of additional questionnaires specifically aimed at measuring the presence and severity of trauma in their childhood experiences, or ending their participation in the study. Participants were clearly encouraged to make the choice that was best for them, with all efforts made to avoid any sense of coercion to participate. All participants agreed to continue their participation into phase 2. In phase 2, participants completed the following 3 self-reported measures of trauma via web-based administration: the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire short form, a 28-item self-reported questionnaire which measures any experiences of abuse and neglect prior to 18. Childhood trauma is the psychological result of an external setback or series of setbacks that render the child temporarily helpless and breaks ordinary coping mechanisms. This includes the presence of verbal assaults on a child's sense of worth, bodily assaults, sexual contact, and failure to provide basic psychological/emotional needs. In addition to providing a total score of the amount of trauma exposure, the CTQ-SF provides subscales regarding emotional abuse and neglect, physical abuse and neglect, and sexual abuse, and a minimization denial subscale, which assesses the individual's propensity for denying their traumatic experiences. Whereas physical neglect is defined as the caretaker's inability to provide for a child's basic physical needs, e.g., food and healthcare. Emotional neglect refers to their inability to provide for basic psychological and emotional needs. Additionally, by computing and summing validated cutoffs of abuse and neglect categories in the CTQ, a total score was obtained of how many categories of abuse and neglect one endured. This practice is similar to the common practice of creating a summative score of one's adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. For simplicity, this will be referred to as the CTQ ACE score. The Trauma History Questionnaire is a reliable measure of the amount and types of trauma an individual has experienced throughout their life. The Dissociative Experiences Scale measures various types of dissociation, a psychiatric construct related to how one separates from normal mental processes. The DES captures dissociative experiences such as daydreaming, as well as abnormal and potentially problematic experiences such as depersonalization, when one's thoughts or feelings seem detached from reality or from their own identity or experience. Higher scores on the DES indicate a higher degree of dissociation. Finally, participants responded to the IECQ described above. And this is where we talk about results for the SUPERNERDs, and they are fascinating. Really go beyond the intended scope of this study and give you a few extra things to think about if you're into that sort of thing. For instance, let me share, as a self-validated asshole, this line with everyone. Quote, "The following regions had more participant responses than the vulnerable system of interest, the larynx. Abdomen and digestive system, 83%. Back neck, 72%. Shoulder, 69%. Chest and respiratory, 69%. And the head, 59%. So 4 out of 5 participants reported what? Abdominal responses to trauma. Trauma affects and weakens the guts, contributing, perhaps, to vocalization and walking gait issues, as we've been speaking about. Anyways, for the rest of the most impactful results, check those links below. Nerds, stay tuned. And here we go, bravely, into the findings details. Otherwise, let us continue with our... All right, you fucking bookworms. Thanks for meeting me here. Let's talk about the specifics of this study, something that we normally skip over because the numbers get a little dense in an audio format. Bear with, we'll break them down into usable concepts to help them stick. Results. Self-reported vulnerable body pathway descriptive findings. PRFs were analyzed to identify each participant's self-reported physical manifestation of stress. 26 participants, 90%, identified the neck, and 12 participants identified the front of neck, as opposed to back of neck, as a vulnerable region. 6 participants, 21%, then identified a laryngeal or voice-specific response, and thus comprise the Laryngo-Responders group. 23 participants, 79%, comprise the non-laryngo-responders group. So, a majority of people experience neck problems under duress. Can confirm, this shit gets crunchy, like I've never slept on a real pillow. Tension migraines soon to follow. But a majority of participants were not laryngeal responders. Only approximately 1 in 5 in this cohort were. It is a less common or commonly noticed response, keeping in mind that these were all self-reported measures. And here comes the line I just shared with you, again, in case you want to take closer note. The following regions had more participant responses than the vulnerable system of interest, the larynx. Abdomen and digestive system, 83%, back neck, 72%, shoulder, 69%, chest and respiratory, 69%, and the head, 59%. Many of the reported responses were consistent with classic acute stress responses, such as heart palpitations, racing heart, and sweaty palms. So, most people experienced guttural responses, neck and shoulder reactions, chest and breathing changes, and noggin somatization symptoms. Personally, I experience or have experienced all, to the point of seeking medical care for them in my 20s, which did not turn positive results. And I have questions about my debilitating, almost daily childhood migraines. Thinking about the environment you grew up in, you might too. It couldn't have been, quote, bad enough to cause your physical dysfunction, right? Regarding abuse types that might correlate with physical dysfunction, they continue, while no laryngo-responders reported experiences of physical or sexual abuse, one non-laryngeal responder reported physical abuse, and 2 reported sexual abuse during childhood. 3 laryngo-responders reported emotional abuse compared to 6 non-laryngo-responders. But those 3 laryngo-responders represent 50% of their category, whereas the non-laryngo-responders, 6 of them, represent only 26% of their category. Physical neglect was fairly uncommon for both. So overall, abuse wasn't extremely common within this group, but what we're seeing does seem significant, because here's the real kicker. 5 laryngo responders, 83%, and 10 non-laryngo responders, 43% of that group, reported experiencing one or more adverse events. Non-laryngo responders, therefore, in general, experienced less childhood stress than laryngo responders, again, by a difference of about half of the reported events, 83% compared to 43%. This is meaningful. And, they say, laryngo responders reported the highest incidence of emotional neglect, 83%, compared to non-laryngeal responders, 35%. So, emotional neglect is our most significant measure to pay attention to. Almost all laryngo responders experienced emotional neglect, compared to only about a third of the non-laryngo responders. That is huge. And as, quote, not commonly assessed as the biggest bang in the list of trauma categories, I think most people would expect sexual or physical abuse should be more impactful than emotions. It does seem that emotional neglect is heavily implicated in later somatic dysfunction, specifically in the throat. However, don't get the idea that other forms of trauma or the comprehensive trauma load don't matter. They say, operating from the stance that having experienced a greater degree of trauma or less ideal communication is worse, results of all trauma variables were categorized in this manner. We coded whether laryngo responders had better or worse average scores on each variable compared to non-laryngo responders. Based on this structure, laryngo responders scored worse than the non-laryngo responders on 75% of trauma subscales, which sort of isn't surprising. If there are more traumatic events overall, as we've already heard, then it tracks that there would be more events in each category of trauma overall, and more stress on the biological system overall. But still, once more, they say, descriptively, 83% of laryngo responders reported exposure to childhood emotional neglect, compared to 43% of non-laryngo responders. A discrepant figure that I simply can't get over. And to further apply that finding, they say participants with emotional neglect had a lower mean ideal internal communication score, mean equals 51. Then the participants without emotional neglect, mean equals 75.5. Similarly, participants with emotional neglect had a lower mean ideal external communication score, mean equals 44.8. Then the participants without emotional neglect, mean equals 78.3. Okay, this means laryngo-responders both communicated with themselves and with others in a less supportive or fulfilling or ideal way post-traumatic event. In the first measure, out of a scale of 100, they on average ranked their self-communication at only 51% idealness, a failing grade, with the teacher also being the student. And in communication with others, the laryngo-responders ranked the experience even lower, receiving about 45% of the communication quality that they needed or desired. Not only were those who were emotionally neglected not able to show up for themselves, but others did not fill the void either. A relationship that most of us will assess as learned self-treatment in response to the treatment provided by others, introjected self-neglect, which explains how the teacher and pupil, being one and the same, failed themselves in the same fashion that others failed them, leaving room here for a deep sigh about the self-compassion that we're instructed to lose by an early age. Non-emotionally neglected participants, on the other hand, rated their self-communication at 75% idealness and other communication post-traumatic event at 78% idealness, showing that the support they received from others outperformed the support that they offered to themselves. But both were significant. Non-emotional neglectors were more capable of being there for themselves compared to those with emotional neglect, with about a 25% advantage. And let's make that clear, a 25% increase in idealness. Wouldn't it be nice to talk to yourself a full 1.25 times more kindly than you currently do or could even dream of? And non-emotional neglectors received a whopping 34% of additional communicatory ideal support from others compared to those with emotional neglect. That's a full third more ideal communication that was available post-trauma for those without emotional neglect compared to the emotionally neglected counterparts. So, cumulatively, non-emotional neglect victims were a quarter to a third more communicatively supported than those with emotional neglect following their traumas. Something that seems awfully significant in general, and especially in this examination of vocal disorders. These conclude our selected results for the AP section of listeners. Feel free to consume, process, and share any thoughts you might have on all of these statistics. And now, let's rejoin the rest of the class to continue with the discussion. The throat, with its vocal capabilities, might be vulnerable to stress load and or associated trauma for some. Beck et al. Tell us the larynx and relatedly its acoustic vocal product and other functions such as swallowing and breathing might constitute a vulnerable body system in some individuals. The most reported stress responses in the present sample included stomach aches, heart palpitations, and headaches, all of which are generally appreciated as, quote, classic stress responses. Descriptive data collected via the custom-made PRF identified that 21% of participants without current voice complaints acknowledge their larynx as a body region that predictably and or habitually responds during times of stress. So While it is more common for other areas to be afflicted by stress and phantom stress responses, including the abdomen, chest, neck, back, shoulders, heart, lungs, and head, reactions that we commonly accept as signals of anxiety or strain. Still, about 1 in 5 participants of this study identified that the larynx, not the back of the neck, could also be afflicted by stress in a consistent manner, not a one-off or uncommon experience that might only be coincidentally correlated with a stress event. Those laryngo-responders self-reported nearly 3/4 more experienced and severe trauma than non-laryngo-responders in each category of trauma. And they experienced both more ACEs and more traumatic events in every category. This validates the idea that long past personal history might cause disorder of the throat and the voice. They say, in tentative descriptive terms, laryngo responders differed from non-laryngo responders on 75% of all trauma measures used in this study, scoring worse in both trauma exposure and severity. These data lend provisionary support to the notion that a relationship exists between personal history and the larynx, and by proxy, the voice, and that the laryngeal region might be uniquely vulnerable during stress for some individuals. Most significantly, though, emotional neglect was most commonly indicated by laryngo responders, 83% compared to only 43% of non-laryngo responders. Now, we can never make definitive statements from one single study, and it is possible that emotional neglect could cause personal characteristics such as shyness that explain the vocal difficulties. And yet, it is also possible that with future research, the connection between emotional trauma, inability to successfully discuss the trauma, and later physiological disorder of the vocal region could be confirmed. The authors state, specifically, self-report of emotional neglect as measured by the CTQ-SF was the most unifying trauma variable for laryngo responders in this pilot study. Of course, no causal relationships can be inferred from this work, and any relationships that do exist might very well be mediated by temperamental or personality characteristics, e.g., assertiveness or shyness. Thus, our strongest conclusion is that these research questions seem to warrant more rigorous pursuit in subsequent studies. However, if this finding is recapitulated in future studies containing larger samples of laryngo responders, it might corroborate a psychoclinical perspective that if a person feels they are unimportant, or their needs remain unmet or ignored, their ability to effectively express their feelings and their needs might be compromised. Broadly, these data suggest that childhood experiences of emotional neglect might negatively impact one's ability to communicate with total ease and/or effectiveness. We also probed the relationship between emotional neglect and one's ideal communication experience, again in a very exploratory manner. Participants who had experienced emotional neglect, 45% of all participants, reported having less ideal internal and external communication surrounding traumatic events. So, based on the lackluster scores in ideal communication after a trauma, it appears that those with emotional neglect histories failed to show up for themselves, with only 51% in ideal communication on average, and that others failed to show up for them. A similar 45 out of 100 ranking for ideal communication from external sources. Non-emotional neglectees experienced far more supportive communication, roughly 75% ideal scores for both self and other communication experiences. This is not the case for those who have not had their emotional needs met. The author's findings implicate childhood emotional neglect as a causative factor that could decrease easeful or effective communication down the road and further validate the results as being cohesive with clinical observations. They say, for example, it is not uncommon for a patient who presents with a functional voice disorder to disclose that they are sometimes known to limit their verbal communication at a general level, to hold in their verbal acknowledgement of emotional state, or to engage in ostensibly inhibitory behaviors such as breath holding and laryngeal muscular hyperfunction. While the present study did not address the cohort's physiological responses to stress, the data are at least theoretically compatible with a behaviorally inhibitory framework. In other words, although this study didn't include measures of physiological responses in real time, but rather relied on self-reports about previous experiences, the research suggests that post-traumatic behavioral patterns could be established during early childhood neglect and other ACEs, which then carry through into adulthood, including learning to somatically inhibit communication attempts at the larynx. And with that, let's hit the conclusion. They say, simply, preliminary findings from this study suggest that the oft-cited voice trauma link warrants further investigations with further refined tools. In particular, experiences of emotional abuse and neglect in laryngo-responders seem worthy of further exploration. So, from this research, it seems not only logical and anecdotal, but perhaps also statistically validated. Trauma affects the ability to communicate. The isolative environment and difficulty explaining distressing emotional events that are common in the traumatic aftermath, or even worse, dismissal and punishment for disclosure, could teach the body not to allow communication to take place with a physiological target. Now, one doesn't have to try hard to imagine that emotional neglect corresponds with an environment of difficult or lacking communication, something that could be further evidenced by the laryngo-responders' reported dissatisfaction in both how they communicated with themselves after a trauma and others. We learn how to talk to ourselves based on how others speak to us. This result suggests that in the childhood home, the individual has already been conditioned to avoid self-disclosure, self-comfort, and self-compassion at the time that the adverse events take place. They cannot turn to themselves for support, and the same result is obtained if attempting to discuss the happenings with others. This further concretizes the learned behavior of not speaking ideally to themselves, based on that rejection from others. In general, when it comes to care, if we don't receive it outwardly, we fail to give it to ourselves inwardly, and both experiences support each other to create a sense of correctness, of validation. In this way, we believe that it is our lot in life or unique role to perhaps be silent, destitute, unexpressed, and unheard, even within ourselves. This behavioral pattern may then stretch all the way into the physical realm, physiologically disabling or diminishing vocal capacity at the point of the larynx. One might suggest that the antidote is to begin ideal self-communication to break the cycle of silence psychologically and physiologically. And with that, enjoy your reflections. Get out of here. I'll talk to you next week. Or continue on to the limitations and future directions of the study in the super geek version of this episode, linked below. Here it is. Limitations and future directions. Let's get into the meat. First up, did you think that we didn't care about breathing in this study? Because, of course, we see how breathing is central to biological system health overall. And, of course, we do care about the effects of trauma on the lungs. They say, this pilot study was an exploratory first step in operationally defining laryngo-responders, though we acknowledge that the explicitly laryngeal focus might be problematic in the context of voice. Specifically, some participants referenced respiratory symptoms that they experienced during times of stress, such as shortness of breath and sensations of tightness in the chest. Given the critical role of respiratory drive in vocal production, our current laryngo-responder operationalization might underestimate the proportion of people who experience voice-related symptoms during times of stress. Future studies might benefit from expanding the working definition of laryngo-responders to include respiratory symptoms. Let's also not forget that these authors used proprietary measurement tools in their investigation, something that is generally kind of frowned upon. We hear about the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire short form and Personal Trauma History questionnaires so often because they have been previously validated or accepted as precise and useful by hundreds of previous studies. When new tools are developed, they have to go through a similar process of observing and editing to iron out the bugs. So, they say. Perhaps the most problematic aspect of the PRF and the IECQ tools is our terminological choices, which commingled distinct but related psychological and experiential concepts, e.g., stress, trauma, emotion, and relevant adjectival descriptors, e.g., difficult, scary. Researchers in the domains of stress, trauma, and emotion have historically grappled with definitions and distinctions of each, and we freely acknowledge that maximal experimental rigor requires a highly curated selection of terms. Another potential problem point for studies: who participates and how those participants are found, both of which can create artifacts or illusions in the findings. They tell us, given the initial findings, the PRF and IECQ do appear to have value for probing larynx and voice-specific vulnerability in a larger sample. However, participant responses may have been biased nonetheless by our recruitment materials for the larger study. These did refer to voice and speech. Future studies might benefit from including a more comprehensive list of physical landmarks to prompt participants or eliminating printed suggestions entirely. It may also be beneficial to ask participants to rank severity of physical response across body systems, similar to how a pain maps specific degrees of pain throughout the body. The IECQ will also require thoughtful editing to resolve similar issues relating to validity. In particular, it was challenging to operationalize meaningful distinctions between internal and external communication experiences, and perhaps those distinctions need not be made. I thought that final sentence was particularly interesting based on our ongoing commentary that we learn to talk to ourselves the way that others talk to us. The authors seem to agree. The separation between desired self and other communication is potentially farce. We desire the same characteristics from both and tend to experience the same characteristics in this way. And more generally, what else could be wrong with this experimental design or depth? They tell us other limitations of this study include small sample size and the fact that the participants comprised a poorly distributed population sample, specifically in that they had less reported childhood trauma than expected in a general population. We did not screen participants to ensure a normal representation of trauma experiences, which might be a useful approach in the future. Since trauma scores and the presence of laryngo-responders were central to this study's design, having a limited spread of trauma data and too small a group of interest are major shortcomings of this study. As always, power is in the numbers. If we have a small group of participants, we have to be less confident in our statistics. It's also worth noting again that they only used women in their sample, inherently skewing the results so they cannot be applied across the board. And lastly, they say, finally, the questions regarding stress and trauma were purposefully broad and nonspecific, as we intended to cast a wide net at this early stage. Yet, not all stress or trauma experiences and responses are the same over one person's lifespan, and an individual's perception of these experiences is likely not static. Future studies would be improved by tighter control over the past experiences remembered, time elapsed between the experiences, and the time of the study, and other such factors. What we can say today is there appears to be a connection between childhood emotional neglect, learned self-suppression in private and interpersonal situations, and potentially physiological disordering that makes expression unlikely, painful, or impossible in the future. And these are findings ripe for self-reflection, self-compassion, and from both self-healing. Speak to yourself the way that you want to be spoken to by others, ideally, and see how the larynx responds to the opposite of stress, comfort, care, and relief that maybe your body has always been waiting for. Thank you for being here. Please don't stop expressing yourself or expressing yourself from expressing to yourself. Do mind all the various systems that could be impacted by stress or artifactual stress responses from the distant past. And I'll talk to you soon, larynx permitting. Take care. Hail yourself. And cheers, y'all. Bye-bye.